What's up, guys? Welcome to a Roaring podcast from Roaring.io, where we talk to some of the best in tech and product management. My name is Jesper Kask, and I'm your host. In today's episode, we're excited to be joined by two highly sought-after sanctions specialists. Louie Vargas, Principal Compliance Officer at Danske Bank, with a background at JPMorgan Chase and Deutsche Bank, to name a few. And Tyler Nielsen, a former US Treasury and State Department sanctions expert, currently the CEO of Sanctions Advisory. We discuss sanctions in detail, what's happening currently in Europe, how companies are affected by new Russian sanctions, and challenges going forward. We also talk about AML and tech in general, and the keys to preventing financial crime. And finally, a disclaimer. Though Louie currently works for Danske Bank, the information, views, and opinions shared are of his own, and do not in any way represent Danske Bank and their policies and procedures. Enjoy the episode. Okay, welcome guys. It's great to have you on here, Tyler and Louie.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So for those, just to kick us off, for those who aren't as knowledgeable in this area as the two of you, what are sanctions and how does it work in practice, Tyler?
Sure. Certainly, we want to make sure we're all speaking the same language, even when we're not speaking the same languages. Right. The best way to think about sanctions are a means of compelling, of harming actors to change their behavior. So, right, that comes in many different forms. Certainly historically, there's lots of different examples of sanctions, be they political, right, isolating, kicking people out of international groups or organizations, or really focused on kind of goods transactions and goods trades, right? Those embargoes that we've seen in the past, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a sanctions embargo. But certainly more recently, and where, it comes a lot harder for, all of us and why we're in this space, is when it comes to the financial sanctions, which are really a 21st century approach to say, right, finance is integral to everything. If we target the financing, then we'll target the exports, we'll target the political isolation. So what does that actually mean, right? So sanctions are means of cutting off targeted actors from engaging in the financial space in specific countries or regional areas. So when the US enacts sanctions, it's cutting off people from accessing the United States. Similarly, when the EU enacts sanctions, it's cutting off people from operating in the European Union. And, all these different, there's lots of different terms that we have. There's designated, there's sanctions, there's blocking, there's asset freeze, right? There's a lot of different words around, but when you boil it down, it's about denying access to specific countries, their financial systems, and how they operate, right? And when it comes to Ukraine, we've seen the whole variety of different sanctions. FIFA's now expelled Russia from tournaments, right? That's a political sanction. But when we're talking about the financial sanctions, we're talking about cutting off oligarchs and officials from being able to keep their money in Europe and in the US and in London. We're talking about companies that can't raise new funds through bond issuance or listing on exchanges in Western capitals. And we're really talking about, again, those goods and export controls, those high-end products that the West makes a lot of, that Russia wants. And now that's been, the biggest and kind of most significant action as of right now. So, right, sanctions about compelling actors to change their behavior. The Ukraine sanctions are about trying to target a whole spectrum of different activities on Russia to try and get Putin to change his behavior.
Mm. And could this be inferred to sort of people, organizations? At what levels could it be inferred?
So it's all levels. It's binding on all of us as individuals, as companies, as the banks that facilitate our transactions. When the EU enacts new sanctions, then that means that we as operators here in the EU must comply with those sanctions. It's a legally binding requirement. You can go to jail if you do not follow the sanctions. Now most individuals, right, we're not doing these transactions. We're not trying to on our own sell, microchips to Russia, but there are obviously lots of companies that come into play. So it's companies and banks that face the primary burden when it comes to complying and making sure that you're operating in the right way. But it does, at the end of the day, apply to all of us, and we can suffer negative consequences. Yeah, up to including jail time.
Yeah, I think it goes um, a lot of different ways too, right? If you're looking at it from a financial institution perspective or any type of business, it affects us, but it also affects the people on the ground in those areas as well. We don't want to forget that, right? The Russians that are innocent to all this, they're being affected by the sanctions that are being put in place on their country. Obviously, the war itself has an effect on the Ukraine, and also Russia's partners to the south, I believe, Belarus, right? They are acting on the behalf of Russia. So now you're seeing more sanctions headed their way. Originally, it was just, um, they were in the spotlight due to the issues they had with the president, having the Ryanair flight grounded so he could take a journalist off the flight and imprisoned. But now you're seeing the impact of Belarus um, hand in hand, helping with this war. Now sanctions are headed that way. So I think we're going to see a lot more focus on not only Belarus, but Russia's partners in this whole kind of scheme. And just to piggyback on what Tyler was saying about sanctions, and it's a 21st century kind of phenomenon, even though historically you could see it, but the financial aspect is kind of the new thing. This is what's called hybrid war, right? Yeah, I'm sure you've heard the term thrown around a lot in different articles, all right? Because it's not only war is not just physical anymore. So hybrid involves sanctions, right? Now we're targeting the financial sector, and then also there's the cyber crimes. So Russia has been guilty of it. There's other countries around the world that have been guilty of it. And even you saw this weekend, there was hacking groups out of the U.S. targeting Russia. So yeah, this is new kind of warfare that we have coming out that's making things very difficult. And to going back specifically to sanctions, with the introduction of sectoral sanctions during the Crimea conflict, but now more so being used as a more kind of, I guess, targeted way to leverage these countries, is making sanctions increasingly more difficult to, be able to ring fence and control and be on top of. People, across compliance, and I would say even our partners in AML say, sanctions is easy because it's list-based. No, that's just the beginning. It goes a lot deeper than that, and I think the world is starting to see that now.
Mm. And in terms of that complexity and the challenge of screenings, I suppose, in these uncertain times, if you will, how should companies handle this?
Yeah, Tyler, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is the reason my company exists, is to help companies
Exactly.
navigate the complexity. Um, there's everyone's heard of screening and doing those checks, right? And as Louis said, historically, it's been known sanctions are easy because you just screen against the names and then you know what to do. Well, that's actually not the way we are. That's not where we are today, and that's definitely not where we're going. Screening is a necessary tool, but it's not on its own sufficient, right? Screening is helpful, but you have to know how to employ it and how to use it. And that really takes making those internal risk decisions for each company, right? And take the, Ukraine example. Our respective leaderships all over the world have taken the decision that they want sanctions to have an impact, but not too great or too immediate of an impact, right? And not to do too much harm to the Russian economy directly or, right, the wider global economy. So what they've come up with is these very technical sanctions, which require a lot of nuanced understanding of both what's restricted and what you're actually trying to sell and provide. So when it comes to how to properly employ screening or how to best apply screening to help aid that, it's knowing what the sanctions are, knowing you as your company, what are you selling? Is it prohibited? Is it not? Is it in that gray area? And then setting up a policy and a direction of this is what we will do, this is what we won't do, right? And then using the screening to say, okay, I know where I'm operating. In all honesty, it's very much a detailed task for each company these days. It's not a one size fits all model. There are lots of information sources that will tell you this might be risky, but what they won't be able to tell you is this is prohibited, or this is not prohibited, or this is in your board of directors risk appetite or not. Um, and so that's where it's certainly a challenge now. It will be a challenge going forward. Uh, but this is certainly a specialty of where I exist. And it's a bit difficult for us, I think, to appreciate how much thinking and discussions going into this on an international political level. And certainly when it comes to Ukraine sanctions and trying to navigate where should we go and how should we understand what's trying to be achieved here so we can kind of anticipate and work through this process. The one thing I can say to take away is, there is ultimate transatlantic unity. So what the US does, what the UK does, what the EU does, they're all trying to achieve the same outcome and the same impact. So while there are differences in terms of the specifics of the language, as long as we keep in mind that that's the direction we're heading in and everyone's trying to do the same thing, it actually can make things a lot clearer and a lot simpler to adapt to, because that the same impact is the desired outcome. But you need good tools, you need good information, you need that supply of information to make the decisions. But it's only you as a company that can make those decisions for yourself, trying to navigate these waters. And there are a few local actors that can help with that, me being one of them.
Great points, Tyler. I just want to add to that. It's true. We see, I think, for the first true time, that there's camaraderie between the major enforcement bodies, being US and OFAC, with EU and the UK. You've seen it here piecemeal, but I think this is the first time, at least that I could recall, and Tyler, you could check me on that. I think this is the real first time that there's been real collaboration. So it's good to see that. And just to go back now to kind of elaborate on what Tyler was talking about, that screening in itself is not all you need, right? You still need experts in the field to help you navigate through it. Technology is as good as the data you put into it. Technology is as good as you kind of tailor it and make it as fit for purpose for your business as possible. So, going back to highlight what Tyler said, you have to know the risk tolerance of your institution, and with that, then you know how to tailor your technology solutions to help you, right? This is just to help um, uh, reduce some of the risk, reduce some of the repeatable tasks like false positives and stuff like that. But this will never, I should never say never, but at least for the near the near future, can't replace a human, because we know the nuances to the regulations, to the laws. We know the gray area, especially gray area that we operate in when it comes to our institutions' risk tolerance. Um, so I know a lot of people get worried to know that, oh, machine learning and AI is coming to compliance. Yeah, but that's just to help the humans concentrate on the risk that's ahead of us. It's not to replace us. Um, so yeah, again, just with all the things that Tyler said, we also have to make sure that we're tweaking and tailoring our technology to appropriately help us. There's very little bit of technology you could take straight out of the box and it's going to work the way you want it. I mean, yeah, it'll screen the regulatory lists, but other than that, you have to tweak it, you have to refine it, make sure the algorithms you're using are appropriate. There's a lot of things that go into it, so I just wanted to highlight that aspect as well.
Going back to the current situation in Europe and the Ukraine, I suppose it's really hard to predict, but what do you think is next in terms of sanctions, and what more can the US and the EU do?
So there's always more. Um, that's the first lesson of sanctions. And right, as part of the transatlantic strategy and unity, what's been deployed is certainly what us in the U.S. and what I have called, the escalation ladder approach, which is a stepped up response in response to what actually is happening on the ground in Ukraine. So there's lots of rhetoric that we've heard from our leaders of, we're going to hit them hard, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But it's really been a phased approach, and that's really where it's going to continue. So where are we on that escalation ladder? I would say we're in the kind of upper middle realm. So there's still more to do. Primarily, that's doing full prohibitions, i.e., blocking or asset freeze sanctions on the companies that are subject to just debt and equity at this point. There's blocking or asset freeze against the largest commercial banks, of which there's been, VTB has been blocked by, the U.S., but there's still more to go in terms of that transatlantic unity, and then there's the holy grail, if you will, the energy sector. We're already seeing companies proactively pull out of the energy sector, so maybe that won't be as necessary. And certainly, this is where the thinking about the global implications of Russia as a major energy producer, what that will mean for us here in Europe, but also in Asia and the US, everywhere. But that's definitely on the table for actions as it goes forward. To correct Louis a little bit, at least in my view from the past, right? There was great effort that was taken in 2014 to impose unified sanctions. But the environment of seizing Crimea is much different than the all-out invasion and attempt to at least remove the government in Kyiv, if not occupy all of Ukraine. And that's where the approach has been, kind of disproportionate, but still on the escalation ladder. I was in the U.S. government doing these sanctions, doing Russia sanctions in 2014, and what we're seeing now was always kind of on the table in response to the actions of the Russian government and of Putin. So now we're seeing that really come to fruition, and the irony of all of this is the more impactful measures that are taken from a compliance standpoint, the easier it becomes, because then it's a full prohibition on doing any business rather than a very selected and nuanced approach. So, it'll very much be in response to what happens on the ground in Ukraine and where, the discussions go between Ukraine and Russia, where the actual events, from a military standpoint go. But there is more to be done. But the more that we see, kind of the simpler it should have, but it will have a greater and more immediate impact on business transactions between us and the West and Russia.
Yeah, thanks for checking me on that, Tyler. I knew I could count on you. So yeah, just to again elaborate more on what Tyler has shared. Um, as things escalate, definitely we could see, how they're going to institute more kind of full blocking or full freezing of assets. So in the financial industry, that makes our life a lot easier, right? Because it's no more, you know, the whole gray area deciding or figuring out kind of the nuances behind it. We just know it's not permissible, and we could process or move forward accordingly. Um, on the flip side of that, I think then that makes it a little bit tougher on society. What I mean by that is that you could already see now with the sanctions that are already in place, the implications on the supply chain. You could see how it's affecting, um, not right now the gas and energy out of Russia, but you could see how um, the commodity goods like grain and other food products out of Ukraine and Russia are not going to where they normally go. So there might be a food crisis. And if you keep thinking about now, even like the metal sector or natural materials, things that we extracted out of Russia that we needed for vehicles and other things, it's gonna we're gonna start seeing the tightening of, you know, these sanctions around Russia, right? But also you're going to see the impact it has on the world. So I think that those are also key things to keep in mind. Um, and as as Tyler said, this collaboration continues, they're going to try to, mitigate those things as they can, right? The U.S. is probably going to step up their agriculture production and start getting that around the world. They've already said that they've started earmarking oil to send around the world to help Europe. And I'm sure other, other nations are already planning how they're gonna, you know, fill this gap that's now the things that are not coming out of Russia and Ukraine. So it'd be
Mm.
interesting to see how that continues as well.
Yeah, there seems to be a fine line between putting sanctions on Russia and the global effect that it has, obviously. And moving on to sort of AML in general, because sanctions is a huge part of AML compliance work for a lot of people, I suppose. What's the biggest challenge today in AML?
What do you think, Louie?
Biggest challenges, I guess, generally in AML. I would say it's it's been this way since I started in compliance, which is about 8 or 9 years ago. Data and technology; those are always the biggest challenges in my mind to make sure that we can get it right, right? Because if we have bad data or we're not receiving enough data, that doesn't just slow our process down, but it also becomes a burden on a customer because now we're asking multiple questions when we already have the answer in another part of the bank, when it should be kind of shared amongst each other. And technology, there's no silver bullet, so I'm not going to say that, companies are not buying the right tech. I think that, you know, um, the issue with tech is that from what I've seen is that a lot of tech is built for today and not for next year or the year after. So it's always behind. You got to get patches all the time. You have to buy new modules. It's and when you think about banks, right? They're looking to make money, not spend money, right? Compliance is always thought of as a not revenue generating, but revenue taking. Um, and that's one of the parts of it, right? We need continually to update our tech. We need to get better at data, whether that's getting a data lake or coming up with other ways that we could share information. Um, yeah, so I think those two kind of really stand out, especially, the fact, and just to, throw this out there, we have to change the paradigm of, that compliance is not revenue generating, right? We're revenue saving.
Mm.
That's what we're here for. We're here to provide the guardrails in order for a business to flow appropriately. We sound the alarm when we need to. Business could push forward, but then you see that when that has happened, there's been monetary issues, reputational impact. So, yeah, sorry to get a little on the tangent there, but I think those are very important to kind of consider. Tyler,
Mm.
what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely agree that's a key challenge, which then feeds off to other challenges. I would say certainly what we've seen in recent time as sanctions and AML have gotten more in the news, and everyone now on the street is aware of it. And I'm sure Louis, you're having the same problem as I am. You want to break from the world, and you go hang out with some friends, and obviously they want your take on Russia sanctions. We can't escape it.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
It's all of us together. But certainly for me, what I'm seeing as the biggest challenge is right. There's been a big push into more data, more tech, but exactly as Louis is saying, it's often right. It's not built for your company. It's built with another purpose in mind, or it's supplying almost so much data that it leaves you saying, I don't really know what I'm looking at. There's been a big push into recording all potential risk avenues. And many different tech companies will tell you that's what we offer. We give you the information for you to make a decision. But well, what decision should I make? Is this prohibited? Is this something real? Is it not? And as you know, that's where we get back to it. The biggest challenge is companies being proactive, taking a stance of what's the business we want to be in. And exactly as Louis said, the old adage was that, well, you check with compliance to make sure it's not prohibited. But in our current environment where the rules are changing all the time, the world is getting smaller, but also getting more volatile, then that old way of doing business is very costly and very cumbersome. And now it's trying to get companies and banks to be more proactive of what do we want to be in the business of, where do we want to do business, who do we want to do business with, and make those decisions earlier Because then from the tech side and the data side, you can then manage it of, right? Do I want to try and do business with Iran, with Venezuela, with Russia, with China? What is my exposure in China? The sanctions picture is going to change. And as long as you always prepare that it's going to change, then that's a good starting point to say, okay, let's define where we want to do business and what we want to do. But it's a process, and this is still very new for many companies, many, not so much banks. Banks are a bit ahead of the curve because that's where the regulatory enforcement has been. But we can look at the Dan Bunkering case here in Denmark recently, right? That's a great example of where we're headed in terms of enforcement against companies for not following the rules, and many of the pitfalls you can get into if you don't follow the rules. I mean, that was a criminal conviction of senior member of their leadership team, or the senior member of their leadership team. So the challenge is for companies to feel that they can be proactive and shape the business that they want to be in, to then use the tools that are available to them, rather than feeling that the tools are telling them what to do and then trying to navigate yet another cumbersome apparatus in addition to the laws that come down, because we're trying to very narrowly tailor the impact to not have unintended consequences. So
Yeah, that's a good point, Tyler, regarding Dan bunkering, right? I think what we fail to recognize in this region, right, the Nordics, is that they've been kind of shielded in a way from a lot of the things, a lot of the work that's been going on with other companies and financial institutions around the world, right? Let's say to the west, right? Um, the western part of Europe has seen this already, and there's already been kind of this approach to rectify issues that have come up, especially in the United States. You've seen that, over the last 10 years or so, right? But the Nordics, I feel like, have been kind of shielded from that, even though they are part of the EU. They are part of this kind of almost other world, right, where everybody's trusting and all our business is good, all our business is clean. But now you're starting to see the ramifications of that kind of mentality, and that's why they're bringing us a lot of us in here, is to kind of help change the bank in a way to bring it forward to where other financial companies, or even other regular, companies that have these issues, are pushing toward in other parts of the world. Because, as you said, there are other nuances that are easily lost in the shuffle of all the things we need to do, right? Um, Especially, if you're the banking a customer who's doing business they shouldn't. What the regulator is not going to give the bank a free pass and say, well, you weren't part of it. No, they're going to say, well, you should know what your customer is doing. You should have known, based on the KYC or the KYCC, what the expectations were, and when they deviated for that, you should have checked them on it. Or you should have seen these money flows or whatever going somewhere else, or they have vessels going to a sanctioned area, all these other things, right? So again, we don't have a crystal ball, but regulators, they expect us to. I mean, that's why we have to be as proactive as we can.
Mm. And as we're coming up on time, I just wanted to ask you both a sort of a final question to leave the listeners with. And I'll let you go first, Tyler. What do you think is key when it comes to preventing financial crime on a sort of broader scale?
when you say broader scale, you mean like society wide or?
Yeah, society wise, yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, what's key to preventing financial crime, as a society at a broader level? Um, you know, Certainly that trust element that we have here, is very key to enabling business. And, it makes a lot of things practically much easier than they are elsewhere in the world. Uh, but what we really need is that, trust but verify mindset of, arms control negotiations, which is by asking questions and following up to make sure that we're really banking who we want to bank, that companies are engaged in the business that they want to engage, then that takes us a really long way towards following the laws that we have in place. Yes, right. We need checks, we need balances, we need the ability for good tech and good data to actually supply that business. But it's really coming with the approach that, yes, we have a very trusting and open society that is very embracing, but we do need to verify that the actual underlying activity is there. We've seen that in a lot of different fraud cases, certainly here in Denmark recently. And these all could have been stopped by, just following up a bit more in terms of making sure that what was really going on was, truthful, was purposeful. And that's really what will take us forward in terms of enhancing our compliance.
Louis?
I couldn't have said it better myself. And it goes to kind of what I was saying before, right? KYC, know your customer, and KYCC, know your customer's customer. I know that a lot of relationship managers, they say they don't want to bother their customer, but again, we have to shift that mindset to say, well, we need this information in order to protect you, to protect society, in order to not bother you in the future, right? We need to know what you're doing. And then on top of that, once they've answered these questions and it's shared, and it's easily accessible with other departments around the bank, especially in FinCrime, then it's check and challenge, right? We have to make sure they're staying within those parameters that we've agreed to do business with them on. If they're not, we have every right to ask, and if they continue to do so, right, then we have to discuss maybe offboarding, maybe other things. So yeah, I totally agree with Tyler. I think it starts with there. That's the fundamentals with protecting against FinCrime.
Any closing thoughts or key takeaways for the listeners?
Certainly. Well, thanks for having us. That's my first thought. And, I would say, key takeaway for listeners is always trust that it's going to change and it's going to be more complex in the future. And, like I like to say, you're going to pay for compliance one way or another. Prevention is always cheaper than, dealing with the consequences after the fact.
Yeah, that's awesome, Tyler. Key takeaways I would say is always be proactive. And, I know that there's a lot of issues in front of us right now, but also try to look in the horizon and see what comes next. As Tyler said, everything changes. So if, the better you get at this, you could kind of predict sometimes what's going to happen, and you could already start tailoring your risk approach based on that. So, yeah, I agree with you, Tyler. That was a good one. And thank you for having us.
Yeah, awesome. I was going to get to that. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated your time, and I hope to see you soon again.
Likewise. Thanks so much.
It was fun. Hope to do it again.
You've been listening to an episode of a Roaring podcast by Roaring.io. Feel free to share it with your friend, colleague, or peer if you liked it. If you wish to stay connected to us, don't forget to subscribe to the show. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.